When Elinor Whitcombe ran barefoot through frozen mud before dawn with empty water pails knocking against her knees, she expected nothing except another small cruelty completed before the household woke. She did not expect Gideon Mercer. The path to Ashwell Creek cut below the orchard wall, through a stand of bare trees, and down toward black winter water glazed with skin-thin ice. Elinor knew every root in that path now. She knew where the ground held hard and where it gave way. She knew how to carry the pails close to keep them from clattering. She knew how to breathe without crying when the cold bit into her feet so sharply that it seemed to rise through her bones. Behind her, from an upper window of Whitcombe House, her stepmother's voice had followed her into the dark. "Do not come back until every bucket is full." Lydia Whitcombe never needed to shout. She could lay humiliation upon a girl in the calmest tone in Virginia. Elinor did not look back. She had been trained out of that impulse. Looking back had once implied that someone might reconsider. No one reconsidered now. At the creek, she knelt, set down the pails, and broke the ice with numb fingers. The water knifed into her skin. For a moment, she closed her eyes. When the horse stopped behind her, she heard it not as thunder but as breath and leather, and the small, controlled sound of an animal checked by a disciplined hand. "You should not be out here alone." The voice was deep and quiet, with none of the lazy amusement she had learned to distrust in men who felt safe around female suffering. She turned. A rider waited among the trees, broad-shouldered in a dark coat, the horse's breath silvering in the dark. He dismounted before she could answer. He bent, picked up the bucket that had tipped in the mud, and righted it with careful hands, as though even the small dignity of a battered pail deserved notice. Moonlight caught his face when he straightened. Severe brow, tired mouth, eyes the warm dark of amber held under restraint. Gideon Mercer. Of Mercer's Reach, former burgess, widower. A man county parlors described as cold because he no longer offered them himself to examine. He looked at her feet first, then at the raw skin over her knuckles, then at her face. "She sent you here barefoot." It was not a question. Elinor should have lied. Habit alone ought to have made the lie for her. Instead, she said, "There was no use spoiling the only pair of shoes I still possess." Something moved in his expression. Not pity. Pity looked downward. This did not. It looked level. He took one of the pails, and then the other. "Walk." She stared at him. "Sir." "Walk," he said again, more gently. "I will carry these." "Why?" The answer came so quickly that she knew it had been waiting years rather than seconds. "Because your father once kept my family from ruin," he said. "Because when my father died, and Mercer's Reach was close to being swallowed by debt, Colonel Whitcombe did not press what was owed, though others urged him to do so. Because when my mother was ill, he sent his physician without charge, and grain besides. Because I remember what such mercy costs a proud man. And because I will not stand by while his daughter is sent into freezing water like a servant punished for theft." The night seemed to alter around her. No one had spoken her father's kindness aloud in that house since his death. Lydia had worn grief beautifully, but she had worn remembrance selectively. Elinor had begun to fear that the better part of her father had already been dissolved into legal phrases and tasteful mourning silk. Gideon shifted the pails as though the matter were settled. "If you wish," he said, and the roughness left his voice, "you may tell me I have presumed, but I will still carry them to the gate." Elinor rose slowly. Her hands had begun to shake, though not from cold alone. "You knew my father well?" "I knew what he did when it brought him no advantage." Gideon glanced toward the creek. "That is a rarer knowledge." He fell into step beside her along the frozen path. His horse followed behind. The pails did not strike against her legs now. His stride absorbed their weight easily. Silence lay between them, but it was not empty. Elinor had lived too long inside rooms where silence had teeth. This silence had space in it. At the orchard wall, he stopped. I should go no farther. She knew it. Even a gate too near the house was danger enough. Yet neither of them moved at once. From the shadow of the bare apple branches, Whitcombe House rose beyond them, dark brick and shuttered windows, and the old geometry of a place built by men who expected inheritance to move cleanly through blood and name. Her father had once laughed in those rooms. Now every corridor seemed to belong to calculation. Gideon set the pails down by the gate. Miss Whitcombe, she looked up. If this happens again, he said, send word to Mercer's Reach. I have no standing from which to send word anywhere. Then find one. His eyes held hers. Your father taught more people gratitude than you know. Not all of us forgot it because forgetting became convenient. She ought to have thanked him. She ought to have stepped back through the gate and ended the scene while it could still be made into something private and survivable. Instead, she said, barely above a whisper, no one has spoken to me as though anything done to me mattered in a very long while. His face changed then, not in softness exactly, but in pain controlled too swiftly to be performance. It matters, he said. A light moved in an upper window. He saw it when she did. The moment snapped taut. Go in, he said. She lifted the pails. They felt lighter than they had any right to feel. When she turned back once from the garden path, he was still there, in the orchard shadow, one hand on his horse's bridle, watching until the door closed behind her. Lydia Whitcombe was waiting in Elinor's chamber before the water had stopped trembling in the buckets. Her stepmother stood near the narrow bed in a dark silk wrapper, one candle in hand. The flame made gold of her widow's rings and smoothed her handsome face into an almost maternal composure. Lydia never looked more dangerous than when she was arranged to resemble virtue. You were a long time, she said. The ice was thicker at the creek. Yes, one imagines a great many things might delay a girl on a dark path if she is not careful what impression she gives. Elinor went still. Lydia smiled with a sadness practiced enough to look effortless. Do not look frightened. I make no accusation. I merely observe how quickly the world invents stories when young women linger where gentlemen may pass. So she knows, Elinor thought. Or she guesses, which in Lydia's hands amounted to the same thing. I filled the buckets, Elinor said. You did. Lydia's gaze rested on the mud drying along Elinor's hem, then on her reddened hands. And I trust you also remembered your place. It was always almost elegant with Lydia. Never a blow, never a shouted insult before servants. She preferred deprivation, implication, isolation. She moved shame by inches until other people began carrying it for her. When she left, Elinor sat on the edge of her bed without removing her cloak. The candle had gone out. The room held only the blue-black shape of the window and the pounding of her heart. Your father once kept my family from ruin. She had thought grief was what remained after love ended. She had not understood that it could also be what returned when goodness was named aloud after a long season of being denied. Before Lydia Whitcombe came, Whitcombe House had belonged to warmth, if not luxury. Her mother had died when Elinor was 14, and the first year after had been awkward with mourning and overkind servants and a father trying too hard to speak brightly at supper. But it had still been a house in which Elinor walked as a daughter, not as a tolerated inconvenience. Then Colonel Whitcombe remarried. Lydia Fenner, recently widowed, arrived with 2 daughters and exquisite judgment regarding what people would believe of a composed woman. Philippa was polished and observant. Greta, prettier and easier to unsettle. Both had learned from their mother that comfort was not merely desirable, but due. The alterations began almost at once. Elinor was moved from her sunlit chamber to a smaller one at the back, because Lydia's girls must not be separated. The music master was dismissed. Household accounts, once lessons shared between father and daughter, were taken up by Lydia under the pretense of relieving Colonel Whitcombe of burden. Elinor's hours filled with the useful, invisible work of a dependent female relative. Inventories, mending, preserving, visiting the still room, copying receipts. None of it was dishonorable. All of it became dishonor when assigned as proof that she needed no education because she was now occupied in the practical virtues. Her father had objected at first. Then he had fallen ill. Illness altered not only his body, but the routes by which anyone could reach him. Lydia received visitors first. Lydia supervised broth and physicians and correspondence. Lydia sat at his bedside when neighbors called, her hand over his, grief already rehearsing its own witness. Elinor was never fully forbidden, which would have been a brutality too visible for Lydia's taste. She was simply delayed, redirected, told he slept, told he must not be fatigued, told perhaps tomorrow. By the time tomorrow failed permanently, Lydia had positioned herself so flawlessly that the county mourned a devoted widow and barely noticed the daughter standing outside the center of her own loss. Then came papers. They had arrived and multiplied like winter weeds after the funeral. Probate copies, inventories, sealed instructions, a guardianship provision supposedly meant to protect Elinor's interests until her 21st year. She was 19. Her father had always spoken of her managing her portion at 18, then, gradually, the wider estate if she wished. Yet the papers Lydia produced gave her nearly complete control as acting guardian over household and lands, with allowances to Elinor administered at Lydia's discretion for the preservation of order and feminine security. Everyone praised the prudence of it. No one asked why Colonel Whitcombe, who had taught his daughter estate arithmetic from childhood, would suddenly have chosen to bind her future to a woman he had married barely 2 years earlier. Everyone, except now, Gideon Mercer. The formal letter from Mrs. Agnes Holt arrived at breakfast 3 days after the encounter at Ashwell Creek. Mrs. Holt, housekeeper of Mercer's Reach, wrote in a hand so neat it resembled moral judgment. She informed Mrs. Lydia Whitcombe that her niece, Dorothea Holt, recently returned from Annapolis, would be grateful for the society of a well-bred young lady of the county and wished to invite Miss Elinor Whitcombe to spend a fortnight at Mercer's Reach as a companion suitable in age and character. Philippa read over Lydia's shoulder. Greta leaned so far that her ribbon brushed the silver toast rack. "How very odd," Philippa murmured. "How charitable," Greta said, though her tone held the fascination of someone watching a bird offered seed at the edge of a trap. Lydia read the note twice. Her face showed nothing beyond mild surprise. Elinor understood the brilliance at once. Mrs. Holt's reputation was iron. An invitation under her name could not be dismissed as improper, nor could Lydia refuse too bluntly without seeming jealous of an opportunity for her stepdaughter's social repair. "What a pleasant thought," Lydia said at last. "Though I confess I had no notion Miss Holt and Elinor knew one another." "We do not," Elinor said. "Then one must suppose Mrs. Holt acts on some report of your quiet usefulness." Lydia smiled and folded the letter. How gratifying. She let the matter rest until that afternoon, when she came to the still room where Elinor was sorting dried rosemary and shut the door behind her. "Mercer's Reach," she said lightly. "A secluded house, a widower master, a niece requiring company. How tidy such arrangements appear on paper." Elinor kept her hands steady over the herbs. "If you object, you may decline." My dear girl, objection is so vulgar. I am considering advantage. Lydia moved closer. You should understand, however, that a young woman without fortune enough to command independence cannot afford the least stain. Men may invite. Housekeepers may supervise. The county may still decide what it likes. And counties do so enjoy deciding. Then why permit me to go? Lydia's gaze rested on her face with almost affectionate precision. Because I would not have anyone say I denied you kindness. Elinor knew then that Lydia intended to allow the visit and make use of it later, whatever shape it took. She went anyway. Mercer's Reach stood above the river under a pale winter sky, old brick softened by mist, its formal gardens clipped into restraint rather than display. It was a planter's house of consequence, but its grandeur held no appetite for witnesses. The drive curved through cedar and opened on a facade that might once have entertained whole counties. Now, it seemed to guard its own silence. Mrs. Holt received her in the hall with a short curtsy and shrewd eyes that missed nothing. Dorothea Holt came flying down the stairs before propriety could fully gather her, all dark curls and quick warmth and unapologetic curiosity. "So you are Elinor," she said. "I have been forbidden to overwhelm you at once, which is very cruel of my aunt because I am delighted already." It was the first easy welcome Elinor had received from another young woman in longer than she wished to count. Gideon Mercer appeared only after tea. He entered the drawing room as though reluctant to disturb it, and bowed with exact courtesy, neither intimate nor distant. Yet when his eyes met Elinor's, the memory of the frozen path passed between them like a hidden ember. "I am glad you accepted Mrs. Holt's invitation," he said. No one else in the room could have heard what she heard beneath the formality. "I am glad you are here, where I can see what happens to you less imperfectly." At Mercer's Reach, safety did not arrive as luxury. It arrived as unforced order. A fire already laid before dusk. A tray sent without comment when Elinor lingered over books and forgot supper time. A maid who addressed her as Miss, without glancing to see whether someone higher in the room approved. It was in these small restorations that she began to feel how stripped she had been. Dorothea was lively enough for 3 households, but she possessed the unusual gift of sensing when gaiety helped and when quiet did more. She walked with Elinor along the frosted river path, spoke of Annapolis gossip, confessed her failed attempts at sketching birds, and then, when Elinor at last laughed without checking herself, simply accepted the sound as something owed rather than miraculous. Gideon remained measured. He joined them at supper, often enough to satisfy decorum, retreated to his library early, and never once referred to their meeting at the creek unless others were present and the subject could not approach it. Yet Elinor felt his awareness of her everywhere. In the extra lamp lit near the small escritoire prepared in the morning room because Mrs. Holt had mentioned she liked copying. In the blue wool cloak left over the chair outside the conservatory after he had seen her there shiver the day before. In the account books quietly made available when Dorothea mentioned, laughing, that Elinor knew more of crop tallies than most men. One rainy afternoon she found him in the library surrounded by ledgers from tobacco years past. He looked up as she hovered at the threshold. "You were taught accounts," he said. "My father believed daughters should at least be difficult to cheat." A corner of his mouth moved. "A principle I admire." He gestured to the table. "Will you tell me whether my overseer's wheat estimates are incompetent or merely hopeful?" She crossed the room. The smell of leather and ash and rain-damp wool thickened around her. She bent over the column of figures, conscious of his sleeve close beside hers, and of how absurd it was that numbers should make her pulse quicken simply because he had invited her into them. "These transport losses are impossible," she said after a moment. Unless your wagons went by sea and were attacked by pirates." He gave a quiet laugh, low enough that she felt it more than heard it. "I had suspected optimism. Pirates are more entertaining." For 2 hours they worked side by side, correcting entries, tracing shipments, speaking in the precise shorthand of people who love facts, because facts can still be mended. When she reached across for a page, her fingers brushed the back of his hand. Both of them stopped. It was nothing, barely contact, yet the room changed with startling completeness. Elinor drew back first. "Forgive me." "There is nothing to forgive." His voice had gone rough. She looked up. He was watching her, not as a benefactor watches a dependent, nor as a man idly pleased by a woman's nearness, but as someone standing very still at the edge of a choice he had not intended to make so soon. Dorothea burst in at that exact moment to announce that Mrs. Holt required witnesses to a pudding disaster. The spell broke. Elinor laughed again, though a little breathlessly, and Gideon turned a page that did not need turning. The companionship arrangement became the county's first convenient topic within a week. Lydia began carefully. She did not call on neighbors to say her stepdaughter had traded herself for safety. Lydia would never commit a vulgar thought in vulgar words. She said instead, over tea and almond biscuits, that poor Elinor had become very useful to the Mercer household, and that in these difficult times one must be grateful when a young woman with little independent establishment found protection suited to her circumstances. She sighed that a secluded widower's house could so easily be misunderstood by people less charitable than herself. She observed that gratitude sometimes wore the appearance of devotion. She wondered aloud whether girls deprived too long of tenderness might mistake guardianship for attachment. By the time these phrases passed through 4 parlors and 1 dinner table, they hardened into insinuation elegant enough to repeat and indecent enough to excite. Dorothea heard the first clear version at a call in town and returned livid. "They make it sound as though you are a pensioner of his body," she said, pacing the drawing room with scandalized energy. Mrs. Holt told her not to use language unfit for draperies, which only meant the insult was grave indeed. Elinor stood by the window, hands folded so tightly that her knuckles whitened. This is what she wanted. Gideon, who had entered halfway through Dorothea's report, said very evenly, "Yes." He crossed the room to Elinor. "Look at me." She did. "I will answer this." "She means to force you into public explanation." "Then I will choose the explanation myself." She searched his face. "Why are you doing this still?" It was the first time she had asked the question directly since coming to Mercer's reach. Gideon's gaze did not shift. "Because your father saved my mother from selling the silver she had left to pay winter taxes. Because he came himself when I was too proud to ask for time and told me that debt settled in panic fed vultures, not honor. Because I have remembered that kindness every year since. Because at first I could not leave his daughter where I found her and think myself decent." His hand tightened once against the back of the chair beside him. "And because now," he said, the words slower, more dangerous for being so carefully chosen. "The reason is no longer only your father." Silence fell. Dorothea, with uncommon wisdom, made an excuse about checking the kitchen and dragged her aunt with her. Elinor's breath had shortened. "No." The single word came out not as refusal, but as warning. Do not say what cannot be unsaid inside a world already sharpening itself against us. Gideon understood. She saw him understand and stop. "Not yet," he said. "You are right. But I will not let Lydia define what exists between us with language that degrades you." I owe you more honor than silence." That night, a letter came from Magistrate Aldred Forsyth requesting, with pointed civility, clarification regarding Miss Whitcombe's residence at Mercer's Reach, and whether any understanding existed that might affect her legal dependency under her current guardian. Lydia's poison had reached the bench. Mrs. Holt read the letter with lips compressed thin. Dorothea denounced the magistrate, the county, and all men who confused a woman's safety with impropriety. Gideon remained very still for several beats after finishing the page. Then he went in search of Elinor. He found her on the east garden path among the winter roses cut down to thorn and promise. The sky had the color of pewter. She had seen his face before he spoke and knew there was fresh injury in the world. "What has she done now?" He told her plainly. He did not soften the insinuation nor disguise the danger. A magistrate's inquiry was not yet a charge, but it placed her reputation and Lydia's claim to moral guardianship in the same frame. If mishandled, it could become grounds for removing Elinor from Mercer's Reach under public pretense of rescuing her from influence. "She timed it," Elinor said after he finished. "She waited long enough that gratitude would begin to look like dependence." "Yes. And if you answer too sharply, she will say a guilty man is angry. If you answer too mildly, she will say you are willing to let the story breathe." Gideon's eyes rested on her with unmistakable respect. That is exactly the board on which she means to play. The winter wind lifted a loose strand of her hair. Without thinking, he reached out and tucked it back beneath her hood. They both stilled at the gesture. He drew his hand away as though from flame, but not before the backs of his fingers had grazed her temple. It was the gentlest touch Elinor had known since childhood. Her whole body registered it. "I am going to make a call," he said, voice lower now. "Publicly. Properly. I will inform Forsyth that I intend honorable courtship, with Mrs. Holt's knowledge and your consent, and that any slander against you is directed against a woman under my formal protection and will be answered as such." Her pulse beat so hard that she could hear it. "Do you mean that as strategy?" He held her gaze. "I mean it first as shield. I mean it also as truth, though not a truth I would press on you before you are free." No declaration could have undone her so completely. Not because it claimed, but because it stopped short of claim. "If you do this," she said, "the county will say I forced your hand." "The county says whatever flatters its own appetite. Let it grow hungry." She almost smiled, then did not. "And if I say no?" "Then I answer the magistrate another way, and continue until Lydia runs out of roads on which to harm you." Elinor looked at the winter beds, at the clipped roses waiting under cold wood for a season not yet visible, and understood that love might begin not in sweetness, but in being offered a choice with full knowledge of its cost. "Yes," she said at last. "If it must be public, let it at least be honorable." Something eased and sharpened in him at once. "Thank you." He should have bowed. She should have stepped back. Instead, they remained too near, the winter garden around them stripped of every unnecessary thing. "I am afraid," she confessed. "So am I." That honesty was more intimate than flattery could have been. He called the next week at Whitcombe House in full daylight with his card and Mrs. Holt's note and the iron composure of a man who had decided to offend hypocrisy beyond repair. Lydia received him in the blue parlor beneath her late husband's portrait, which now hung where Colonel Whitcombe's ought to have dominated the room. Elinor sat by the window, sewing untouched in her lap. Philippa arranged herself with interest. Greta tried and failed to hide her alarm. Gideon spoke first to Lydia, as courtesy required, informing her that his regard for Miss Whitcombe was serious, that her present residence at Mercer's Reach had been supervised with full propriety, and that he intended to continue paying formal attention to her with a view toward marriage, provided Miss Whitcombe herself wished it, and provided her legal affairs could be disentangled from irregularities he had reason to question. Lydia's smile remained exquisite. "What a noble speech," she said. "One could almost mistake concern for impetuosity." He did not blink. "One could also mistake elegant malice for family feeling." Philippa inhaled sharply. Greta looked near tears. Lydia set down her teacup. "I am sure I cannot imagine your meaning." "Then let me spare you the labor. Any suggestion that Miss Whitcombe has purchased my protection by impropriety is false. Any repetition of it will be treated as defamation." How beautiful Lydia looked when cornered. How civilized. "My dear Mr. Mercer, you must not attribute to me the vulgar exaggerations of a county eager for entertainment. If I expressed concern for appearances, it was only on Elinor's behalf. She is, after all, a dependent girl with so little to recommend prudence except necessity." Elinor felt the old anger rise, cold and clear. "I have prudence," she said. "What I lack is a guardian who values my good more than my obedience." The room went still. Lydia turned her head slowly, as if astonished to discover speech in furniture. "You speak very boldly for someone whose comfort rests upon papers she has never read intelligently." "I have read them," Elinor said, "and I have begun to wonder why the clause placing all discretion in your hands appears in a different formula than the rest of my father's instructions." For the first time, Lydia's gaze sharpened beyond control into danger. It lasted only an instant, but Gideon saw it. When he and Elinor later stepped into the hall, his voice was barely audible. "You should not have had to do that." "No," she said, "but I am glad she knows I can." Their sleeves brushed as they paused beside the door. So little contact. So much fire banked beneath it. The first attempt to challenge Lydia's control failed. Barnaby Hatch, Colonel Whitcombe's old solicitor, had been absent in Maryland during the weeks of illness and funeral, delayed by fever and flooded roads. Once found and summoned, he came to Mercer's Reach like delayed conscience in a narrow black coat, white hair precise, document case held as though the law might yet be persuaded to behave if carried straight enough. He examined the guardianship papers, frowned, adjusted his spectacles, and declared that something was wrong but not yet provable. The seal appeared proper. Colonel Whitcombe's signature was genuine on the final page. The suspicious clause lay not in the signature, but in the body of the copied instrument, an insertion granting Lydia unusually broad management powers and extending Elinor's dependence well beyond customary practice. Bad drafting at best, Hatch said, fraud at worst. But bad drafting is not criminal merely because it is convenient to a villain. So they pursued the clerical route first. Mr. Everly, a county advocate known for cautious competence, petitioned quietly for inspection of the probate packet and comparison against registry notes. The packet had already been recopied. The original fair copy was missing. The registry book contained only the later entry, neat and official. The clerk on duty at the time had since died. His deputy remembered little. Lydia produced 2 witnesses prepared to say Colonel Whitcombe had been anxious about his daughter's softness and had wished his capable wife to govern until Elinor had matured in judgment. One witness was a cousin who owed Lydia money. The other was a physician who had seen the colonel twice and confused weakness with incapacity. Forsyth advised patience. Privately, he admitted to Gideon that he smelled rot, but formally, he would not move without harder proof. County courts preferred continuity over embarrassment. The second attempt failed more painfully. Elinor herself found among her father's old desk ledgers a memorandum in his hand about portions to be settled directly to my daughter Elinor upon her 19th birthday with Mr. Hatch's guidance. It was powerful in conscience, useless in procedure. Lydia dismissed it as an abandoned note superseded by later prudence. Philippa came one wet afternoon to Mercer's Reach under pretense of returning a borrowed book. Her gloves trembled when she removed them. "I did not come to betray Mama," she said before even sitting. "I came because Greta cries at night and because things are no longer what she says they are." Elinor waited. Philippa stared at the carpet. "I remember Mama asking for Father's signet after he was too weak to get out of bed. I remember she kept Mr. Hatch's earlier draft and sent for another copying clerk because the first one was slow and sentimental. I remember—" She stopped. "But I did not see enough, not enough to swear." "Why tell me at all, then?" Elinor asked more gently than she had expected of herself. Philippa's eyes filled with humiliated tears. "Because I am beginning to understand that silence is not innocence, simply because one dislikes noise." It was not the testimony they needed, but it altered something in Elinor. She had spent so long surviving Lydia's household that she had forgotten corruption could wound even those trained to benefit from it. Gideon found her afterward in the library, standing very straight beside the fire. "Well?" he asked. "She is afraid." "So are many cowards." Elinor turned toward him. "Do not make her smaller than she is simply because she was not brave soon enough." His expression changed. "No," he said after a pause. "You are right." That was one of the things she loved before she fully named it. When he corrected himself, he did not perform humility. He simply moved nearer truth. The rumor campaign intensified as the legal path slowed. At the Phoenix winter dinner, Lydia spread her most lethal version yet. She lamented, with eyes lowered in polished sorrow, how grateful she was that Mr. Mercer intended to do the honorable thing if poor Elinor had indeed inspired feelings strong enough to overcome prudential caution. She prayed only that impressionable girls might not learn from the affair that protection could be earned by attaching themselves to powerful men in moments of staged vulnerability. The table listened in delighted horror. Gideon set down his wine glass. He had agreed to attend because absence would look like shame. Elinor, seated 3 places away, felt the room tilt towards spectacle and feared what his anger might cost. Instead, he rose with extraordinary calm. "Since my name has been employed," he said, "I should like to spare the room any uncertainty. Miss Whitcombe did not seek me. I found her barefoot at a frozen creek after midnight carrying water under orders unfit for a servant, let alone a gentlewoman. If there is shame in this county, it lies not upon the person who endured that treatment, but upon those who made it possible and those who found it entertaining once described." No one moved. Lydia's face remained arranged, but color had left it. Gideon continued, "My regard for Miss Whitcombe is open, serious, and honorable. If any here prefer to suggest otherwise, I recommend they do so in a way that allows me to hear them clearly." Elinor had never seen power used so cleanly. When the company dispersed awkwardly into lesser conversations, she stepped into the dark side passage for air. Her hands would not stop shaking. A moment later, Gideon followed. "I am sorry," he said at once. "I should have warned you I meant to speak." "No." Her voice broke on the single syllable. "No. I have spent 2 years having words spoken around me, about me, over me. Tonight, someone spoke for me without taking me away from myself." He was too close in the narrow passage. Candlelight from the supper room gilded one side of his face and left the other in shadow. "Elinor," There was her name again, held not like possession, but like something he feared to bruise. "I wanted to kiss you in that room," he said quietly. "I did not. I will not, while your freedom can still be used to stain you. But I wanted to." Every nerve in her body answered. She lifted her chin. That was not an apology. No. Good. For one dangerous, suspended instant, neither of them breathed. Then footsteps sounded beyond the door, and they stepped apart with the speed of people whose restraint had become the shape of desire itself. The third attempt at the case nearly broke them. Hatch discovered a discrepancy in the paper stock. The page, containing the guardianship clause, bore a watermark from a batch sold in Norfolk 6 months after the rest of the instrument had likely been drafted. It was the first hard irregularity with teeth, yet Lydia's advocate countered that the document had been recopied later for clarity and then signed in full, making the newer paper irrelevant. Without the original copyist or the missing earlier version, doubt remained only doubt. Everly warned that if they forced formal accusation too soon and lost, Lydia would emerge sanctified as a widow, persecuted by a love-struck widower and an ungrateful stepdaughter. For the first time, Gideon looked tired in Elinor's presence, not with his old grief, but with present fury, exhausted by method. She found him alone in the study one midnight, coat unbuttoned, candles burned low, her father's papers spread like wounded birds across the desk. "You are still awake," she said. "So are you. I heard you walking overhead." He gave a humorless smile. "I suppose I must learn stealth as well as litigation." She came to stand opposite him. "What has failed now?" "Everything except my refusal." He rubbed a hand over his mouth. "If I could simply remove you from all of this and marry you tomorrow, I would. And I despise that thought because it suggests your liberty may be solved by exchanging one male authority for another." The honesty of it struck her deep. "You despise it because you are not Lydia," she said. His eyes lifted. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, very slowly, she set her hand upon the papers between them, palm down. He placed his over it. No gloves. No accident. Skin to skin. Heat moved through her so sharply it was almost pain. He drew breath as though he had been struck. "Elinor." "I know." He turned her hand and looked at the redness there where the winter had roughened it. With his thumb, he traced the small cracked line near her knuckle. The gesture was intolerably intimate in its tenderness. "You should have salve," he murmured. "You are the one bleeding into paperwork." That made him laugh softly, helplessly. The sound loosened something in both of them. When he lifted his head, the distance remaining was ceremonial rather than real. "If I kiss you now," he said, "I will remember it in court and hate every man who thinks he may reduce it to evidence." "Then do not kiss me for them." The answer undid him. His hand rose to her face, paused for permission, received it from the way she leaned into the touch before he had fully touched her, and then his mouth met hers. It was not hurried. It was not innocent either. It was the kiss of two people who had been honorable past comfort, and now found that honor, having held, could bear desire without coarsening it. He kissed her as if learning a truth slowly, so he would not damage it by haste. She felt the control in him, the hunger inside the control, and answered, with one hand sliding up into the cold silk at his collar, because she needed something of him to hold while the world shifted. When they broke apart, both of them remained very still. "Now," Gideon said, voice ruined, "I am going to find your salve before I commit some greater scandal against constitutional order." She laughed then, helpless and bright and almost tearful. He pressed his forehead briefly to hers before stepping back. The next morning, Mrs. Holt observed both of them over coffee and chose not to be surprised. Dorothea looked delighted and was instructed by her aunt to look less alive in company. The case turned because Elinor stopped searching where men had told her the answer ought to be. For days, she kept thinking of Philippa's frightened recollection. Another copying clerk, slow and sentimental. Lydia would never have retained a man who loved exactness if exactness opposed convenience. Why dismiss him? Why not simply ignore him? Unless he had seen too much. She asked among the servants older than Lydia's reign. Most knew nothing. One remembered a clerk sent away in rain after an argument in the passage. Mrs. Holt consulted discreetly through networks of capable women who carried counties on the underside of mail paperwork, learned that a former scrivener's assistant named Obadiah Pike now kept school in a parish 30 miles south. Gideon wished to go at once. Elinor insisted on accompanying him to the neighboring town where Pike had gone for market, because she believed a frightened man might tell a powerful widower less than he would tell the daughter of the house whose ruin he had watched. Snow threatened, but did not fall. They met Pike in the upper room of an ordinary inn, a narrow man with ink-stained fingers and the air of someone who had survived too many employers by cultivating invisibility. At first, he denied everything. Then, Elinor set her father's memorandum before him and said quietly, "I do not ask whether you can save me from shame. That is already spent. I ask whether you mean to help a dead man be told truly." Pike looked at the paper for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice shook. He had been hired by Lydia after Colonel Whitcombe worsened, first to make a fair copy of Hatch's earlier estate instructions from dictation notes already prepared. Those instructions settled Elinor's portion under Hatch's supervision and allowed Lydia residence for 1 year with specified household allowances. Pike had objected when Lydia later demanded a second clean copy containing a new guardianship clause and broader control. He was told the colonel had amended his wishes verbally. Pike asked to see the signed note or hear it from the colonel himself. Lydia dismissed him the same day. "Did you keep anything?" Gideon asked. Pike swallowed. "Only because I feared blame if the books were ever questioned." From inside his coat, he produced a folded half-sheet, Pike's original copyist draft of the relevant article, bearing Colonel Whitcombe's dictated structure without Lydia's expanded guardianship clause. More than that, the margin carried Pike's own notation of interruption. Mrs. W. requests substitute language, Mr. H. absent, await authority. It was not itself a signed instrument, but paired with the memorandum, the watermark discrepancy, and Pike's testimony, it was the missing link they had been denied. On the ride back, the sky already darkening, Elinor trembled so hard Gideon reined over and took her gloved hands in his. "We have it," he said. "Perhaps. We have enough to crack the wall." She laughed once, breathless. "I had forgotten what hope feels like in the body. It is almost unbearable." He took off one glove and pressed her cold fingertips to his lips. The kiss on her hand was more devastating than many kisses to the mouth might have been. "I know," he said. Lydia struck back before the hearing. She sent word through counsel that if Elinor persisted in scandalous accusations, Philippa and Greta would be ruined beyond marriage and the household servants dragged into public scrutiny. She hinted that Gideon's interest would not survive the expense of a wife whose name had become a county exhibit. She let it be known that women who confused rescue with entitlement often discovered too late that men preferred gratitude to equality. For one terrible evening, the pressure worked. Elinor sat in the small blue morning room at Mercer's Reach with Lydia's message open before her and felt old guilt crawl up through new courage. Philippa's frightened face returned to her. Greta's tears, the servants, the county. The way one woman's fight could become another woman's punishment in a world built by men and administered by mothers trained to survive inside it. When Gideon entered, she held up the letter without speaking. He read it and went very white. "I can withdraw," she said before he could speak, "not from truth, but from public accusation. Take back the courtship. Let her think she has frightened me into prudence. Later, when I am of age, no." The force of it silenced the room. He knelt before her chair, an act so startling from a man like Gideon Mercer that she forgot even to breathe. "Listen to me," he said. "The reason I loved your father before I ever knew you was that he did not bargain with justice only when it was cheap. Do not dishonor his memory by calling submission strategy, and do not dishonor yourself by thinking my regard depends upon convenience. If you end this case, end it because you choose peace over battle with open eyes, not because a cruel woman has reminded you that cruelty can spread." Loved. There it was plainly at last. She looked down at him, at the man who had once stopped in winter for gratitude and now remained for love, and felt something steadier than hope take hold. "What if I choose battle?" she whispered. His answer came without hesitation. "Then you will not fight alone a single hour of it." She touched his cheek. "Then I choose battle." He closed his eyes into her hand for one heartbeat before rising. The hearing convened at the county hall in a room built for property disputes and male patients. Yet on that morning, every bench held spectators pretending civic interest while craving social blood. Lydia arrived in black silk with Philippa and Greta behind her, all three composed enough to resemble virtue in procession. Gideon escorted Elinor, but then, by prior agreement, took a seat apart rather than at council tables so no one could say the case had swallowed her voice. Barnaby Hatch sat on one side with Mr. Everly and Obadiah Pike waiting pale but resolute. Forsyth presided with a face arranged toward neutrality and eyes already tired of the county's appetite. The opening went badly. Lydia's counsel argued first that the petition was a late-born fiction manufactured by a suitor wishing to free a dependent heiress for marriage. He praised Lydia's administration, her sacrifices as widow, her protection of an inexperienced girl prey to romantic manipulation. He suggested that Elinor, long indulged in sentimental notions by her father, had misunderstood ordinary guardianship as oppression, because Mr. Mercer encouraged her to imagine herself wronged. To hear your life reframed by hostile intelligence is a peculiar violence. Elinor sat straight through it, hands cold in her lap, and did not once look down. Everly answered cleanly, but the room still leaned toward Lydia's elegance. The physician repeated his useless testimony. The cousin lied smoothly. Philippa, called unexpectedly, admitted only that her mother handled papers in the sick room and that she herself had never read them closely. It hurt Elinor to see how terror narrowed her. Then Pike took the stand. He shook visibly as he identified the draft, his employment, the dismissal. Lydia's counsel attacked at once. Pike was low-paid, resentful, unsummoned by official authority, conveniently in possession of an unsigned half-sheet after years of silence. Why had he not come forward sooner? Because, Pike answered, gentlemen seldom protect clerks who accuse ladies with seals and standing. The line rippled through the room. Hatch then produced the paper stock comparison, the memorandum in Colonel Whitcombe's hand, and the sequencing of earlier instructions known to him from pre-illness consultations. Step by step, the architecture of Lydia's story weakened. Yet Forsyth still hesitated. Fraud in inheritance required not only suspicion, but confidence enough to overturn a widow's legal authority before a whole county. Elinor realized in that instant that proof alone might not suffice. The court needed motive rendered visible, not greed in the abstract, but Lydia's method. When Everly asked whether Miss Whitcombe wished to speak, several heads turned with faint surprise. Women in such rooms were usually exhibits, not minds. "I do," Elinor said. She stood. The hall seemed suddenly very small. She could feel Gideon's presence from across the room, not as instruction, not as rescue, simply as unwavering witness. "My father intended me to inherit more than income," she said. "He intended me to inherit practice. He taught me accounts. He showed me lease terms. He corrected my sums and laughed when I beat his steward to a discrepancy. The clause that claims he found me too soft in judgment to hold my own estate is false, not because I feel injured by it, but because it contradicts the life he built with me in plain sight." A murmur ran through the benches. She went on, steadier now. "Mrs. Whitcombe never struck me. I say that because open cruelty is easy to recognize, and hers was cleverer. She removed me from rooms where I might learn. She spoke concern where she meant diminishment. She taught neighbors to call my exclusion prudence and my labor feminine usefulness. And when I was taken to Mercer's Reach under Mrs. Holt's name, she spread it gently through parlors that I had found a manner of trading myself for safety. That is how she works. She does not break a door. She persuades everyone inside it that I belong on the other side." Every woman in the room heard that sentence. Even some men did. Elinor looked then, finally, at Lydia. "If my father had truly wished me governed, he would have told me so while he lived. Instead, I was kept from him. Others may decide whether the papers are false. I am here to say that the life arranged around those papers was." When she finished, silence held for a long, suspended moment. It broke not with outcry, but with the small, hard sound of Philippa rising. No one had called her again. She stood anyway, pale and shaking. "Mama told me to say father feared Elinor's judgment," she said, not looking at Lydia now. "But he never said that in my hearing. He said Elinor had a better head for estate matters than most sons. I heard him. And I saw Mama ask for the signet after he could scarcely hold a spoon. I was afraid. I am still afraid. But it is true." Greta began to cry openly. Lydia half rose, color burning into her face for the first time. "Philippa, sit down." Forsyth struck the table and ordered silence. That was the final turn. Not because Philippa alone proved the fraud, but because Pike's draft, Hatch's analysis, Elinor's testimony, and Philippa's frightened corroboration suddenly aligned into one unmistakable pattern. Substitution under cover of caregiving. Social coercion dressed as family duty. Legal language. Weaponized against the very woman it purported to protect. Forsyth recessed briefly and returned with the decision that Lydia's guardianship authority would be suspended immediately pending full criminal inquiry. Management of Elinor's portion and Whitcombe House would pass under temporary neutral supervision through Hatch, and Miss Elinor Whitcombe, being of age under the original settlement scheme, as now credibly evidenced, would act in consultation regarding her own affairs. The hall exhaled like a struck animal. Lydia did not collapse. She was too disciplined for that. She sat rigid, beautiful, and murderously composed as the structure she had built was taken from her in the language of law. Across the room, Gideon did not move at first. He waited until Elinor had signed the necessary acknowledgment herself. Only then did he cross to her. He did not sweep her into his arms. He did not stage triumph. He stood before her with eyes brighter than she had ever seen them and said, so quietly that only she heard, "You did that." She had thought freedom might feel like joy. Instead, in the first instant, It felt like weight leaving bones she had forgotten were carrying it. "I thought I might fall apart," she whispered. "You may," he said. "I am here for that also." Outside the hall, the late winter light had turned almost spring-like. Crowds eddied around them with the astonished hunger people bring to the end of a story when they realize the woman they meant to consume has survived the telling. Gideon offered his arm. She took it. At Mercer's Reach that evening, Mrs. Holt ordered champagne opened for a household that had not expected such luxury in years. Dorothea kissed Elinor's cheek and then Gideon's and declared herself the true architect of justice because she had disliked Lydia from description alone. Hatch permitted himself half a glass and admitted the county might not be entirely unsalvageable if people insisted on inconvenient evidence. Even Mrs. Holt smiled in a way that transformed her whole face. Later, after the house had quieted, Elinor stepped out to the east garden. The air smelled of thawing earth. Behind her, the library windows glowed gold. Gideon followed after a few minutes, cloak over his arm. "You are cold," he said. "Not enough to go in." He settled the cloak around her shoulders himself, his hands lingering a fraction too long at the collar. She turned within the wool and faced him. "It is over," she said. "The case is not entirely over. Lydia will still face further charges." "You know what I mean." "Yes." For a moment they simply stood there, the dark garden around them no longer a place of waiting, but of possibility. Elinor could hear distant water beyond the trees, the same creek, the same county, the same world, and yet nothing in her felt arranged by other hands now. "I have loved you for longer than was prudent," Gideon said quietly. She smiled through sudden tears. "You are very devoted to prudence for a man who keeps losing to it." His mouth curved. "Only with you." "I think," she said, breath catching, "that I began to love you the moment you named my father's goodness on that path. I only did not know whether love was allowed to women who were still fighting to belong to themselves." He lifted one hand and touched her face with reverence, stripped of all caution now, except the caution love keeps because it values what it reaches for. "It is allowed," he said. "It is not owed, but it is allowed." She rose onto her toes and kissed him first. This kiss was nothing like the midnight one in the study. That had been banked fire. This was release. He gathered her carefully, and then, with increasing helplessness, as though each answer she gave him unmade another layer of restraint he had worn too long. His mouth moved over hers with a tenderness so intense it bordered on ache. When she drew back for air, he kissed the corner of her mouth, her temple, the place just beneath her ear where her pulse leapt under his lips until she trembled and laughed and hid her face against his coat because dignity had become impossible. He held her there, cheek against her hair. "Are you unhappy?" he murmured. She made a scandalized sound against his chest. "Entirely miserable." "Good. I had hoped not to misread you." By spring, Whitcombe House was under repair and under Elinor's direction in all but ceremonial wording. Hatch insisted on order. Elinor insisted on usefulness. She rehired 2 dismissed servants, reopened the account room, and discovered that power felt less like command than like stewardship correctly placed. Philippa wrote from the smaller house to which Lydia and her daughters had removed under supervision, apologizing without self-excuse. Greta enclosed pressed violets, and the line so earnest it hurt to read. "I think fear can make a person cruel, even when she means only to be safe." Elinor answered both. Not warmly, not coldly. She was learning that mercy did not require amnesia. The county, denied its preferred tragedy, turned gradually toward a new appetite: admiration. People spoke now of Elinor's composure, Elinor's intelligence, Elinor's brave testimony, as if these had not existed before law made them fashionable. She let them speak. She no longer needed social memory to be honest in order for her own to remain so. One mild afternoon she rode with Gideon down the path to Ashwell Creek. The orchard showed first green. Mud gave under the horses' hooves where winter had once struck iron hard. At the bank they dismounted. "This place frightened me," she said. "It does not now?" "It does." She looked at the moving water. "But not in the same way. It has become the place where my life refused the shape chosen for it." He stood beside her in silence. Then, after a moment, "I nearly rode past that night." She turned. "I had taken this path for months because sleep avoided me. I saw someone at the creek and thought first only that it was not my business. Then the moon shifted, and I saw your face." He exhaled slowly. "I knew you at once from your father. The same eyes. The same way of holding hurt without making performance of it. I thought, if I ride on, I become the sort of man his kindness did not save me to be." Elinor took his hand. "And now?" "Now," he said, lacing his fingers through hers, "I would stop for you in any season and on any road left to men." She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. The creek moved beside them under the new light of spring, no longer black and punitive, but restless, alive. 3 months later, on a warm June morning with roses along the garden wall and the windows of Whitcombe House thrown open for air, Barnaby Hatch stood witness to the entirely proper engagement of Miss Elinor Whitcombe and Mr. Gideon Mercer of Mercer's Reach. Dorothea cried before anyone else, and denied it with theatrical indignation. Mrs. Holt oversaw a breakfast so good that even Hatch, enemy of exuberance, accepted a second role. The servants smiled openly. The orchard beyond the wall shone in full leaf. Gideon placed the ring on Elinor's hand, not as a rescue completed, but as a future offered between equals who had already seen one another at the worst thresholds of shame and law, and had remained. When the guests dispersed to give them a moment alone in the restored garden, Elinor looked up at the old stone wall her father had built, and at the house that was hers again, not as prison, not as museum of injury, but as a living place altered by survival. "I used to think freedom would look dramatic," she said. Gideon stood close enough that the back of his knuckles brushed hers. "And does it?" She considered the roses, the open windows, the sound of workers in the far stable yard, the ring on her hand, the man beside her whose first reason had been gratitude and whose last was love. "No," she said at last. "It looks like being able to choose what tenderness enters the gate." His expression changed in that quiet way she loved best, the one that made it seem some private chamber of him had opened just for her. "That," he said, drawing her into his arms beneath the June light, "may be the most beautiful definition of home I have ever heard." And when he kissed her there in the garden her father had once tended, with summer rising around the walls, and no one left with power to turn her dignity into currency, Elinor kissed him back with all the steadiness she had fought to earn. She had gone down to frozen water as a girl being taught to disappear. She came back, at last, as the woman who named herself and was answered by love in full daylight.